A somber Friday dawned over Jerusalem. Heavy clouds massed above Golgotha, poised for a moment destined to cleave history itself. At the base of three stark crosses, a Roman centurion moved with grim purpose, fulfilling his duty. It was yet another crucifixion, but this one centered on Jesus of Nazareth. His objective was unequivocal: ensure Jesus' death. And with cold precision, he executed his task. As the sixth hour arrived, an inexplicable darkness descended, blanketing the land until the ninth hour. Then, at that ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a powerful voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" With one final resounding cry, Jesus breathed his last. In that very instant, the great veil of the temple was violently torn in two, from its pinnacle to its base. And the centurion, who stood directly before him, his gaze fixed on the scene, uttered words that would echo through time. Truly, this man was the Son of God. On that epical day, the Roman soldier's life was irrevocably altered. The man who had been charged with overseeing Jesus' execution was utterly shaken to his very core. He transitioned from a mere executioner to a profound witness. The hand that had moments before pierced Jesus' body with a spear now belonged to the first Gentile to truly believe he was indeed the Son of God. Forsaking his esteemed rank within the most formidable empire on earth, he cast his lot with the followers of Jesus. He then carried the message to distant lands, proclaiming the gospel with the fervent conviction of one who had seen it all and whose entire existence had been utterly transformed. Yet his eventual tragic end cemented his place in church history under the name now widely remembered, Longinus. Before that fateful Friday, Longinus embodied the quintessential Roman centurion. These were no ordinary soldiers. Centurions were elite legion commanders, each responsible for over 100 men. They commanded immense admiration for their unwavering discipline, battlefield courage, and unmatched effectiveness. Longinus's entire existence had been forged in the crucible of toughness, violence, and unyielding duty. To ascend to the rank of centurion demanded more than brute strength. It required intelligence, strategic acumen, and above all, a chilling ruthlessness. Longinus possessed all of these traits in spades. His life was a rigid framework of discipline, order, and absolute unquestioning obedience to Rome. He had stared down death countless times without a flicker of emotion, executed countless orders without hesitation, and had become, in every sense, a finely honed instrument of the empire. But as that fateful day dawned, the city was not yet fully awake. Though hurried footsteps already echoed through its narrow streets and hushed voices whispered a name that spread like wildfire through the pre-dawn gloom: Jesus of Nazareth. The previous night, he had been apprehended in the Garden of Gethsemane, delivered by the betraying kiss of one of his own disciples, Judas Iscariot, who had sold him for 30 pieces of silver. He was then brought before the Sanhedrin, the high council of chief priests, who swiftly accused him of blasphemy for proclaiming himself the Son of God. There, they subjected him to beatings, spat upon him, and condemned him. Yet their authority stopped short of execution. For that, they required Rome's approval. And so, with the first light of dawn, they led him before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Pilate, seated upon the judgment seat, observed Jesus with a curious gaze before posing the direct question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered with profound calm, "You have said so." As the chief priests and elders pressed their relentless accusations, Jesus remained steadfastly silent. Perplexed by this quiet defiance, Pilate leaned closer and asked, "Don't you hear everything they were accusing him of? Aren't you going to defend yourself?" Jesus remained silent. Not a single word escaped his lips. He neither justified nor defended himself. Pilate was utterly astonished. He had witnessed countless criminals beg, lie, and weep in desperate attempts to save their lives. Yet this man before him possessed an overwhelming and unshakable calmness. Just then, a messenger swiftly approached the tribunal, bearing an urgent message from Pilate's wife. "Have nothing to do with this innocent man," the message implored, "for I have suffered greatly today, in a dream because of him." Pilate shifted restlessly in his seat. He sensed something far greater than himself was unfolding, a current he was utterly powerless to stop. During the Passover feast, it was customary to release one prisoner. Pilate seized upon this tradition, seeing it as his chance to escape this predicament, and presented the crowd with a choice: Jesus or Barabbas, a notorious criminal, a known murderer. But the chief priests and religious leaders had already stirred up the crowd, inciting them to shout with furious anger, "Release Barabbas!" Pilate, raising his hands, asked, "Then what shall I do with Jesus?" The crowd roared with a collective fury, "Crucify him!" Uneasy, Pilate asked once more, "Why? What evil has he done?" But their response was fiercer than before. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate saw clearly that he stood powerless before the rising tide of their fury. He took a basin filled with water and, before the entire crowd, ceremonially washed his hands. "I am innocent of this righteous man's blood," he declared. "His fate rests with you." Then, Pilate released Barabbas. He handed Jesus over to be crucified. The Son of God's fate was sealed. The soldiers led Jesus into the praetorium. Longinus, the centurion, stood steadfastly at the entrance as he always did. He had overseen dozens of punishments. He had watched countless men die. But on this day, something felt distinctly different. The prisoner before them offered no resistance. He didn't scream, he didn't curse, he didn't beg. He endured each brutal blow as if he knew it was necessary. The soldiers, cruelly amused, stripped him of his clothing. They bound him tightly to a pillar and began to whip him mercilessly. The whip fell again and again, tearing flesh without pity. Yet even then, he did not cry out. Longinus watched, arms crossed, his face hardened by years of violence. Yet something in his eyes had begun to shift. The other soldiers mocked him. They placed a purple robe around his shoulders, twisted a crown of thorns, and drove it onto his head. Blood streamed down his face, yet his eyes remained open, steady, and strangely calm. They placed a stick in his hands as if it were a scepter, knelt before him, and laughed, shouting mockingly, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Longinus did not join in their mockery. He only watched, and for the first time in years, he felt a profound unease, not because of the violence itself, but because of the inherent dignity of this beaten man. They spat on him, struck him repeatedly on the head with the stick. Finally, when they tired of their cruel game, they tore off the robe, dressed him again in his own clothes, and prepared him for crucifixion. But Longinus could not look away. Something within him, still dormant, began to stir. He couldn't understand why this man refused to defend himself. He couldn't comprehend why, amidst such profound humiliation, there was no hatred etched upon his face, only an overwhelming, serene compassion. While others around him laughed, Longinus began to question, who truly was this man? He didn't know yet, but very soon he would. For on that pivotal day, Longinus was destined to witness the greatest act of love the world had ever known. And from that moment forward, his life would be irrevocably changed. The soldiers seized Jesus, roughly pushing him out of the praetorium. Onto his already weary shoulders, they placed a rough, heavy cross, already stained by the histories of other condemned men. The arduous path toward Golgotha had begun. The centurion Longinus marched at the front, efficiently clearing the way through the burgeoning crowd. It was his duty to lead the prisoner to the very place of crucifixion. Golgotha, the Hill of Skulls, where those Rome wished to erase were sent to die. Jesus moved forward amidst a cacophony of shouts. Some spat upon him, others hurled insults, yet there were also those who silently wept, their sorrow a stark contrast to the surrounding cruelty. In the midst of the surging crowd, his mother Mary desperately sought him with her eyes. Unable to see him, she turned to the disciple John. "John, help me," she pleaded. "Take me to my son." Together, they pushed through the throng. But suddenly, a soldier shoved Jesus violently. His already weakened body collapsed onto the unforgiving stones. It was his first fall, the cross crashing down heavily on top of him. Soldiers struck him again, yelling fiercely, "Get up!" With agonizing effort, Jesus slowly rose once more. Mary and John reached him just as Jesus fell a second time. Mary could no longer hold back. She rushed to his side, knelt beside him, her hands trembling and her eyes overflowing with sorrow. In a broken voice, she whispered, "I am here." Jesus lifted his bloodied face and softly replied, "You see, Mother, I make all things new." It was not merely a phrase of comfort. It was a living prophecy of what was about to unfold. The heavy cross pressed relentlessly into his wounded back, his body already beginning to give way, and Jesus fell once again. The soldiers whipped him, attempting to force him back to his feet, but he could not rise. His knees simply refused to respond. Longinus watched closely. He had seen it before. Men defeated, men utterly broken. But Jesus, he wasn't defeated. There was something within him that simply could not be broken. Then Longinus, the centurion, grabbed a man from the countryside who was passing by and commanded, "Him, you there, pick up that cross." Slowly, Jesus raised himself. His eyes sought those of the stranger, and though utterly exhausted, he offered a glance filled with profound gratitude. As the procession continued, Simon helped Jesus carry his cross. A solemn death march moved through the streets, witnessed by the entire city. Women wept openly. Bleeding and weary beyond measure, Jesus turned towards them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep instead for yourselves and for your children." Longinus heard those words, and once again, something shook deep within him. Who was this man who, even on the very brink of collapse, could think about others? At last, they came to Golgotha, a dry, desolate hill reserved for the most horrifying spectacles. The 3 crosses were already prepared, and the soldiers began their grim work. Jesus did not struggle. He did not curse or resist. He stretched out his arms as though willingly offering his body, as if surrendering himself freely. Then came the moment. One soldier held down his arm. Another raised the hammer. A cry seemed to sink into the very heavens. Mary shuddered. John looked away. The crowd murmured at every sickening blow of the hammer. Some wept, others continued their mockery, and Longinus stood there, motionless, his gaze fixed. When the 3 men were crucified, Jesus in the center, a criminal on each side, the soldiers struggled to raise the crosses upright. The heavy wooden post sank into its hole with a jarring thud, and Jesus' body shook violently from the impact. The criminals crucified alongside Jesus screamed. One of them glared contemptuously at Jesus and shouted, "Aren't you supposed to be the Christ? Then save yourself and save us too." But the other criminal, weakly yet with genuine sincerity in his voice, rebuked the first and said, "Don't you even fear God? Seeing that you're under the same sentence, we deserve our punishment. We're getting what our deeds deserve. But this man, he has done nothing wrong." Then he turned toward Jesus and whispered, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied with a promise whose echo would resonate throughout eternity. "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Longinus, watching from his post, couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had witnessed many executions, but he'd never seen anyone like Jesus. Time passed, but the world itself seemed to stand still. The sunlight faded, and a chilling veil of darkness covered the whole land. Longinus stood watch, his eyes fixed upon him. Jesus, hanging upon the cross, still spoke. But his words weren't cries of pain. They were words of profound forgiveness. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." A shiver ran through Longinus's chest. Forgiveness for those who whipped him, for those who nailed him down, for those who mocked him, even for him. In the distance, thunder began to roll. A storm was approaching. Caiaphas, satisfied with the day's grim outcome, left alongside the other religious leaders. But Mary remained there, heartbroken with grief, while John gently held her close. In a weak yet remarkably clear voice, Jesus spoke, "Woman, behold your son." Then, turning to John, he said, "Behold your mother." Jesus' body began to falter, and suddenly, with a cry that shattered the oppressive silence, he called out to heaven, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some nearby thought he was calling for Elijah. They believed he was pleading for heavenly intervention, that the prophet himself would come to rescue him. One bystander ran, soaked a sponge with vinegar, placed it on a reed, and raised it to Jesus' lips. But Jesus did not drink. He refused comfort. His sacrifice had to be complete. A solemn silence fell upon the scene. Jesus lifted up his gaze, knowing the end was near. Then, gathering every last bit of strength within him, he cried out, "It is finished." Heaven held its breath, and for the last time, Jesus raised his eyes to the sky and said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." With those words, he bowed his head and died. Suddenly, the earth answered. At that very moment, the ground beneath everyone's feet began to quake. A violent earthquake shook Jerusalem. Rocks split apart. Tombs fell open, and the great temple veil tore in two from top to bottom. The crowd fell silent. Faces that once mocked now filled with terror. Many began beating their chests, realizing the horrifying truth of what they had done. Then, the centurion Longinus dropped to his knees. Words escaped from his lips before he could stop them, and with a trembling voice he declared openly, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." The centurion who oversaw his crucifixion became the first Gentile to publicly acknowledge the crucified Christ. And then, silence fell like a shroud over Golgotha. Jesus' body hung lifeless. The soldiers, disturbed by the growing unrest and the eerie atmosphere, began to withdraw. The crowd, confused and fearful, scattered. It was preparation day for the Passover, and Jewish custom demanded that no bodies remain on the crosses during the Sabbath. So they went to Pilate, requesting that the legs of the condemned be broken to hasten their deaths. The order was passed to the centurion Longinus, and he gave the command. Without hesitation, the soldiers grabbed a heavy iron bar, approached the thieves crucified alongside Jesus, and shattered their legs. Longinus knew that Jesus was already dead. Yet it was his duty to verify it. It was Roman law. So Longinus took up his spear, moved toward the cross, and with one swift thrust pierced Jesus' side. In that moment, blood and water flowed out. The evangelist John, who was standing there, would later solemnly write, "And he who saw it bore witness, and his testimony is true." Longinus gazed at the wound and then at his spear, stained with that pure blood. Unknowingly, he had just witnessed the fulfillment of prophecy. They will look upon him whom they have pierced. It was a profound symbol. Blood to redeem, water to purify. The blood fell upon his face, and tradition tells that his eyes had been suffering from an ailment that clouded his vision. Yet, as soon as that sacred mixture touched his eyes, his sight was miraculously restored. Right there at the foot of the cross, beneath the skies still weeping, Longinus finally understood. He understood that he hadn't executed a mere rebel. He had thrust his spear into the very body of the Son of God. He fell to his knees once again, but this time as a true believer. The Holy Scriptures don't detail every moment that followed. Yet, church tradition and various ancient writings recount what came next. Longinus, profoundly shaken and disturbed by what he had witnessed, could not simply return to the camp as if nothing had happened. For days, sleep eluded him. The image of Christ hanging from the cross, silent and still, haunted him like a fire that refused to die out. He could no longer follow orders without wondering if he were serving truth or a blind empire. After the crucifixion, rumors began swirling through Jerusalem. Whispers that Jesus' tomb had been found empty. Some spoke of visions and encounters with the very man he had watched die that day upon the cross. The centurion listened in silence. Yet every word reached deep within, igniting something new in his heart, in the depth of his soul. He knew it was no lie. Something within him whispered that death had not been the end. For days he found no peace. Images of Golgotha haunted him like a sacred fire. He remembered every word Jesus spoke, every glance, every silence. And while the world returned to its routines, he could not return to his. He could no longer be the ruthless centurion he'd been for years. His heart, forged from iron and bloodshed, began to crack. When he heard the rumors that some had seen him alive, he wasn't surprised. He felt neither skepticism nor confusion, only quiet, powerful certainty. Yes, it was true. Jesus had overcome death. For the first time, Longinus began to truly understand faith. For the first time, he grasped the real burden of the cross, the miracle of forgiveness, and the mighty power of redemption. At last he understood. He resigned his position. He shed his armor, returned his sword, and without looking back, left the Roman army, and thus began his journey of faith. He joined the disciples, sought out those who had known Jesus, and started to learn from the very one he had once executed. His name, Longinus, began to spread among the first believers. The Roman centurion who had led men in the name of empire now walked barefoot, his heart ablaze, proclaiming a king whom he had once helped crucify. For years he journeyed throughout the regions of Cappadocia and Caesarea in modern-day Turkey, proclaiming the name of the one he had once crucified. "I watched him die," he would say, "yet in his death I found life." His testimony was powerful. He didn't speak from theory or hearsay. He had been there himself, and his story moved hearts. The hand that once wielded the sword now courageously raised the word of the gospel. There, Longinus preached the good news, and many believed because he wasn't just any preacher. He was the centurion who had stood at the foot of the cross. But Rome did not forgive those who turned away from its authority. And so, persecution soon followed. Longinus was arrested. He was interrogated, beaten, and threatened with death. They offered him freedom in exchange for denying Christ. Yet Longinus, with the peace of one who had discovered the truth, responded with unwavering faith. Thus, he was condemned. The same empire that once trained him as a soldier would now execute him as a traitor. They took him outside the city, and there, atop a lonely hill, he was beheaded. Longinus died as a martyr, not in fear, but with eyes lifted, upward, mirroring the final gaze of the one he had watched on the cross, who had surrendered with the words, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." His body was laid to rest in the region of Cappadocia. Soon after, local Christians began to venerate him as a saint, with numerous claims of miracles and healings occurring at his tomb. His name, once synonymous with execution, became celebrated as that of a witness, a fervent believer, a steadfast martyr. Through the passing centuries, the Church formally recognized him as Saint Longinus, the one who saw, the one who believed, the one who ultimately died for him, who first died for all. Yet he was not alone in his transformed faith. There were others: Peter, John, James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Thaddeus, and James. From the dusty streets of Jerusalem to the far corners of the known earth, these 12 men carried a message powerful enough to challenge kings, topple ancient temples, and cleave history itself in two. They possessed no army, no swords, no political alliances. All they wielded was the unwavering faith in what they had witnessed and the compelling power of their own testimony.